What's up, y'all? Jonathan Ramirez here, Thriving Earth Farm. Just wanted to real quick talk about the top mistakes when buying homestead properties or buying land, to farm and homestead on. I've been doing lots of property consultations the past few years for people moving to the Middle Tennessee and Kentucky area, and people wanting to homestead and live off the land. And there's the same mistakes sort of repeating over and over again. And ideally, people will reach out to me before they buy the land. Sometimes people make great land decisions and buy just super great pieces of property with all, the right things and everything to a T. A lot of times people don't know what they're doing, buy a piece of property, want to do stuff that they can't really do with that property. So in this video, I'm going to talk about it. Let's hop right into it. I'm just going to go down a list that I have here and just kind of talk about each one. Before I get into that, I just wanted to say that sometimes you can't buy the most ideal piece of property because you can't afford it. Obviously, the most ideal properties are going to be the top dollar thing. Like, we would all buy, properties with all the bells and whistles and all the acreage if we could, but there are price limitations with that, and we can get into different ways of getting past those price limitations and working with what you can, but depending on what you want to do, if you buy a piece of property and you want to do something that you can't do with it, it's going to end up costing you a lot of money to get to that place, and sometimes you can't even get it to that place. Anyways, let's hop into it. The first one that I have listed is not buying enough land for the visions, desires, and goals that you have. So a lot of people are like, I want to raise, 100 head of cattle and do all rotational grazing, grass-fed beef. I also want to raise chickens. I also want to do about an acre in crops. Is 5-6 acres enough? And I just got to say, no, that's not enough. What you want to do if you're getting into a specific thing that you want to do, like let's say you want to raise 40 sheep and you want to do them rotationally grazed, how much pasture are you going to need for that? Look into that before you buy the land. Talk to the subject matter experts in your specific area that are already doing that. Like, find people that have grass-fed, rotationally grazed cattle and sheep or goat or whatever the thing you're wanting to do. Talk to those people and say, how much land are you grazing them on? Is that the proper amount? Do you wish you had more? And then go from there and make your decision. Obviously, it's not just like X amount of land for X amount of sheep for X amount of cattle. There's other factors too. What condition are those pastures in? How steep are those pastures? Are they super rocky, lots of bedrock showing, been abused for years? Because how far each pasture is going to go is going to be dependent on the quality of the pasture too. That's just one example of not having enough land for your visions or desires. Another way that people don't get enough land for their visions and desires is they say they want to have all these big orchards, plus the grazing, plus they want to have community, plus they want to have X amount of forest, and just not really accounting for all that sort of stuff. A lot of times people are like, hey, I want to start a community that produces all its own food, and I'm looking at this 7-acre property. I'm like, okay, all your own food might be a stretch on a 7-acre property if you're having community. How many people do you want in your community? Well, we want to be able to put up at least 10 homes. Number one, in a lot of places, the permitting and the codes are not going to allow you to do that on such a small acreage. In some areas you will be able to get away with that, but in a lot of areas you won't. Number two, you're not going to be able to support, that amount of people on that amount of land, Maybe in the most ideal situation where you're have all these super intensive growing methods and all that stuff, but a lot of times people are like, I want to grow all my own food, and they don't have the land for it, and they also don't realistically know what that's going to take. If you think about how much bread you eat, how much grains you eat, how much beans you eat, how much meat you eat, and all of this stuff combined, and put that and say, I want to grow all of it, you're going to need a decent amount of land. And number two, you're going to need more than just yourself. You're either going to need to rally lots of people to work for you, or you're going to need to be living in a community where everyone's doing different jobs. But that is another video on top mistakes people make when they get into homesteading. So not enough lands for your visions, goals, and desires. The next one is too much land for your experience levels, too much land for your experience level, for the tools that you have, and for your actual capacities. Before I get into this, I will say that too much land is rarely a bad thing. Even if the land goes untended, and the type of world that we're living in, the economic state of things, and just the situation that the world is in, I always tell people, get as much land as you possibly can afford and still be able to live, survive, and not struggle. Reason for that being is there's more and more people, and there's less and less land, and the more land resources you have, the better, and the more you can do with it. I'm not saying go out and hoard a bunch of land, but what I am saying is get your land resources now, so that if you want to scale up in the future, you can. Or if you want to create a community, you can. Or if you want to bring family members into the land, you can. So get as much land as possible. Now, all that being said, sometimes people get tons of land and they have zero experience. They don't have any tools to manage the land, and they just don't have any skills or capacity. Maybe they don't even have time because they're working this crazy job. Basically, in that sort of situation, you're going to need to hire people to do everything. If you want to bush hog fields, or if you want to do any sort of jobs on the land that require tools like tractors or even draft horses or whatever, and you don't have those tools, then you're going to have issues maintaining the land and doing the things that you want to do. A lot of like old farms, like big farms in Tennessee, you'll see that the farmer there has like tons of barns, tons of sheds, has like 3 or 4 tractors, an excavator, a bulldozer, 2 small dump trucks, a big dump truck. Like, there's a reason that all of these old farms have lots of tools that they've accumulated over a period of time, is because otherwise the maintenance and care of that land or the development of that property would be incredibly expensive. That's why farmers almost always do the work on the farm themselves, whether that's putting in culverts, fixing roads, creating access to new areas, thinning out forests, harvesting firewood or timber for the sawmill, or whatever. If you hired all that stuff out, it's going to be incredibly expensive. So the farmer generally buys all the tools to do that stuff over time and does it themselves. Because even when you buy the tools, with the amount of work that you're doing, it ends up being cheaper to do it yourself. A lot of times you don't have the skills or capacity to do all of that stuff, or you don't have the experience to do that. So maybe buying a big property is not for you. A lot of times people will buy a big property, they realize they don't have the tools, skills, or capacity to work with it, and they either make a change in 2 different ways. Number 1, they sell the property and they scale down. Number 2, they bring more people into the project, which is always a great idea. The next mistake when people buy homestead properties is buying land that is too steep. It's one thing if you buy a property where there's some flat land and there's some steep land, and there's some rolling land. And then there's properties where it's all just steep land. Now, a lot of people who buy steep land, and they're like, well, think about all the terraces that, you see in like the hills of Guatemala and Mexico, and like even, in other areas of the world where there's steep topography, and they make it work and they make something beautiful. And, you can have all these microclimates and steep topography, and all of that is true. You can work with steep land, but it's harder. And if you want to make it go quick and you don't have tons of hands on deck to make it happen, it's going to be expensive. And there's also a danger in working with steep topography. If you don't create your terraces and your roads and your earthworks correctly, you might be dealing with landslides, erosion, flipping over tractors or flipping over heavy equipment. Steep land is always harder to work with. That is 100% true. All that being said, there's benefits of working with steep land. The main thing is having that microclimate, and then also using the topography to your advantage. Using dramatic falls in terrain to harvest water, to move materials. One good example of this is I have a friend who grew up in Sardinia, I think I said that right, where they were harvesting all these chestnuts, and they would put chestnuts in these big baskets, because all the chestnuts were growing on steep slopes. And they would harvest the chestnuts into the baskets and then run them down a cable to these smokehouses where they would smoke the chestnuts, and they would run it down again in a cable down to an area where they would be loaded on the trucks and sent out. Now, because of all the steep topography, they were able to use that topography to move all of the stuff quickly and not even have to carry it or put it on trucks higher up or whatever. So there's ways that you can work with the steep topography. Another thing too is steep topography can give you protection from high winds and can put you in these valleys that are somewhat protected or create microclimates. That can be good, and you can use that to your advantage. But steep topography can be very hard. A lot of the terraces and agriculture and work that you see happening in steep topographies come in situations where people have no other option but to buy steep land because it's the marginal land that they can afford. And usually in those situations, they have lots of hands on deck that can create those terraces and manage that land with lots of hand tools. If you're not doing it with lots of hand tools, then you're talking about bringing in heavy equipment and doing that, and it gets really expensive. So if you think about it, if you have a nice flat plot, let's say most of your land is steep, but you have 1 acre of flat, then you can use that flat area for your annual agriculture production, even some of your fruit production, your chicken grazing, and having a mixed use area. You could just get on the land and start doing it. You don't have to build all of these terraces, build all these drainages, make all this access, and it's going to get you going a lot quicker. The other thing too is a lot of times steep topography is used for cattle grazing or for other grazing of goats or other animals. And that's a good way to use steep land, as well as orchards or tree crops or timber production. Like here in Tennessee, a lot of steep topography is logged or grazed or put into pine plantations. And a lot of that stuff is not done well. Like a lot of the grazing is very overgrazed type of grazing and leads to erosion, cut out gullies. A lot of the logging and forestry is done in really aggressive and destructive ways, which makes the land very prone to fire, makes it very prone to erosion, and just erodes the landscape. There's good ways to do that, but you really have to think about maintenance of those systems. One example is I was checking out a property for clients who wanted to buy a property and wanted to have a good amount of cattle grazing that they're doing and sheep grazing. And I went to look at the property, and once I saw it in person, I realized how steep the property was, and that there were lots of divots and drops and rocks and really steep in some areas. And grazing cattle on that would be fine because the cattle can walk on that, the sheep and goats and stuff can walk on that, and they don't really have an issue with that. But you have to remember that cattle and sheep and goats are not going to eat everything. So if you're grazing and you have no other way to manage it, whether it's by fire management, mowing, roller crimping, there's lots of different ways that you can manage out undesirables from your pastures after the cattle have gone through it. But in steep terrain, it makes it harder. If you're going to be mowing it, which is the most common way to follow a graze, is to mow it right away after they're grazing it. So you take down the undesirables, and you don't end up with a pasture that's like all sort of undesirables. If you're mowing steep ground with lots of undulations and rocks and divots and stuff like that can be very dangerous, and you can flip a tractor. That can be done. You just need to have the right equipment for it. You need to have a steep slope tractor that can handle, heavy stuff, or you have to be on small enough scale or have enough people where you can do it by hand. Like in the mountains of Sardinia, for example, in the chestnut groves, they would graze sheep and goats in the understory. And then to manage out the undesirables, they would come in afterwards, and many people together would scythe that land so that it would put the undesirables back at a competitive level with the grasses and forbs and perennials and stuff that they wanted to grow, so that it wouldn't get overrun by the things that the animals weren't eating. So steep land. The next top mistake is land that has no open land at all. This happens a lot. This is like maybe the number one thing that people get into. They buy a property that's completely forested and overgrown. And it's one thing if you buy completely forested property and the main thing that you want to do with the property is harvesting acorns, harvesting walnuts, growing mushrooms, doing crafts and traditional woodworking projects and all that sort of stuff. Every property is going to be different for each person, but I always recommend that people get a balance of open and forested land. And the reason for that being is that a lot of times you have people that will buy a property that's a fully matured forest, completely closed canopy, like 10 acres of completely closed canopy. Trees are 36-inch diameter and up, with some hardwoods that do well in the shade growing in the understory and some other understory plants. And they come to the property and they say, I want to raise cattle. Or they come to the property and say, I would like to have about 2 acres of diverse fruit orchard. Or I want to have a big solar array for my house. People have to remember that when homesteading and farming and growing lots of food, the economy that you're working with is the sunlight economy. And if the property is completely forested and all of that sunlight is getting caught up in that top canopy layer, then you're not getting sunlight at the lower layer where livestock will be grazing and where human beings will be growing food. Now, there are food resources in a forest situation. But if you have a balanced situation, it's going to be a lot better, and it's going to open up your capacity to grow more food in that layer. Now, another top mistake when buying property is buying property that has no forest resources whatsoever, and it's just open, flat land. You don't have firewood. You don't have, oak trees to gather acorns from. You don't have walnuts to gather walnuts from. The wildlife, don't have a diverse habitat to work in, and, or you don't have any shade for your livestock. So that can be the other extreme. With completely open land, you can get a reforested situation happening a lot quicker. And you can decide what gets reforested. You can say, I want improved varieties of black walnut. I want improved cultivars of shagbark hickory and shellbark hickory. I want chestnut trees and pear trees and improved cultivars of American persimmon and Asian American persimmon crosses. And you can revegetate and reforest that land. You can plant lots of black locust and cedar for fast growing lumber and firewood, and really guide that. But you won't have a lot of forest resources to work with immediately. On the other side of it, if you buy a property that's completely forested, people underestimate how much it costs to clear land. And one of the big types of work that we do is low impact land clearing. Our land development company with Thriving Earth Farm and Development is clearing land. One of the things that we do is land clearing. And land clearing can be more expensive than people think, depending on the situation. Now, if you bought a piece of property that's a young growth, like an old field regrowth, and it's not that old, then it's not going to be that expensive to have a forestry mulcher come in, mulch up that land, save some good keeper trees to give you some shade, to have you some stuff to work with, and to open it enough to the point where you can plant your gardens and orchards and graze some animals and all that sort of stuff. But if you have a really mature forest and that's the only thing that you're working with, and you want to start taking down trees, it starts getting expensive. The reason it starts getting expensive is because to be able to properly maintain it afterwards, you're really going to have to grind the stumps out, pull the stumps, and you're dealing with lots of heavy brush that comes out of that system. Now, a lot of people say, well, I'll just get the property logged and then we'll just clean up the logging slash and then we'll at least make some money from it. Here's the deal with that. Most of the time, people end up logging the property. Let's say you're working with a 10-acre property and you have the property logged. You might make $20,000 from it. But 10 acres of really dense logging slash, like if you're clear cutting that and you're in this resulting super dense logging slash, it's going to cost almost double that, maybe more, to clear it, depending on what the situation is. Now, you could have the loggers come in and just push everything into a pile and burn it, but then you're really dealing with a devastated landscape that has had all of the 50 to 100 years worth of accumulated organic matter being burned off, and you're left with these barren, bare soils that are prone to eroding, and you're still left with all these stumps all over the place. A lot of people say, oh, I'll just leave the stumps. Now, that's okay, but what ends up happening is the pastures and the resprout from all of that starts to overgrow really rapidly, especially here in Tennessee in the southeast. And when that stuff regrows, you have to maintain it. And to get in there to maintain, especially if it's not perfectly flat ground, you're working on steep slopes with stumps everywhere, and the stumps are hidden in the regrowth. So that's when a lot of people damage their bush hogs, flip their tractors, and it just takes a really long time to maintain and work with. Like you're taking down this forest that really maybe could have stayed standing, A lot of times in those situations, what I recommend to people is don't get your property logged. You might make $20,000 from it, but you're gonna have to end up paying another $20,000 on top of that to clean up the logging slash. If you start from the beginning and just pay $20,000 instead of clear cutting it, just do a selective thinning, then you can keep a lot of big, healthy, mature trees and thin some out, and have a diverse age diversity in your forest, and still create a silvopasture that at least animals can use. And you can selectively thin patches within that forest for things like orchards and things like garden space. So if you have someone in your area, if you're not experienced in land design and land management, and you have someone in your area that's knowledgeable in that area, call them up, have them come out and see what sort of low impact land clearing can happen. You're not going to get a paycheck from it like you would if you got the property logged, but it's going to be less aggressive on the landscape, and it's going to leave you with good forest resources, as well as opening up land to create other farm and homestead resources. But having no open land definitely gives you a lot of work right off the bat. And sometimes you can't afford that super open land, and you have to go with it, but you're going to pay for it on the other end of it. So think twice about it. The ideal situation would be having a property that has 50% forest, and 50% open land, depending on what you want to do. Some situations you might want more open land if you're doing a lot more, grazing and planting orchards and all that sort of stuff. But if you're into more craft, homesteading, firewood production, sawmilling, mushrooms, wild foraging from the indigenous trees and stuff like that, hunting, fishing, then maybe more forest resources works well for you. So the next one is the next top mistake when buying land that I see is buying land that has no water. A lot of properties have city water, depending on where your property is at. If you're outside of that zone where city water is at, and city water is usually really bad for plants and for human health. If you don't have that water, you're going to rely on well water, and a lot of properties don't have wells already. Some do, but some of those wells are in disrepair or have, old lead components that need to be, repaired, or just, cleaned out and just created, put a complete new well system in. But water resources is important, and a well is not the only water resources that you want to shoot for. The most ideal situation when you're buying a property is buying a property that has multiple water sources. Our property here is in a sort of suburban area. It's on like the suburban rural interface, and our property has city water, well water. It has a year-round spring, and it has a pond, and it has a stream, and we do rainwater catchment. The more water resources that you have, the more resilient you're gonna be, and you want to shoot for as much water resources as possible. And if you have a well, you want to find out the flow rate of that well and see how many gallons per minute it puts out, or it can put out, because sometimes a well can only put out as much as the horsepower of the engine and the pressure tank can put out, but the actual aquifer that it's pulling from can put out a lot more than that. So something to think about. If you're dealing mostly with spring water, like a lot of Amish farms and Mennonite farms that I've come across, don't have well water, but they tap into really heavy flow springs that are just always flowing and always really good. If you come across a property like that, make sure that the spring water is not coming from a contaminated source. That does happen quite often. So you want to trace back the catchment zone for that spring, which can be different than what the topography is actually showing. But you just basically want to do a flyover on Google Earth and a drive around to see what's going on in the area. If you have a spring that has heavy flow, and everywhere upstream from that spring and in the watershed of that spring is highly aggressive commodity agriculture, you might want to think twice about that. Springs are great because water falls on the landscape, infiltrates into the landscape, hits a confinement layer like bedrock or a heavy clay layer, and then finds a way out. And as it's going through the soil, it filters itself. And wells do the same, but it doesn't catch everything. So you want to think about that. And that leads to another top mistake when buying land, is buying land that has toxic exposures. You might come across a piece of land that's been in commodity agriculture for a really long time and has high amounts of pesticide, herbicide, and synthetic fertilizer residues both in the soil and in the aquifers on the land. Or you might buy a property that is across the street or otherwise adjacent to polluting industries. You really have to think about that, and you have to think about what you want your actual exposure to be. I always tell people, if you can find a property that's like been grazed by animals, maybe it's been overgrazed a little bit, but it's not a CAFO, and they're not doing a bunch of herbicide applications on the property. That's always better than buying a piece of property that's been in commodity agriculture. So that's something to think about. The next top mistake when buying a homestead property is land that has no infrastructure and the purchaser lacks the financial capacity or the skills to develop that infrastructure. This is kind of a buying mistake, but it's also a new homesteader mistake. A lot of people will buy a property that has no infrastructure. A lot of times you can't afford a piece of property that has a lot of infrastructure, so you have to buy raw land and put in the sweat equity to do it. But that's going to take some time, and that's going to take financial resources, even if you do it yourself. So if you can find property that's fenced and cross-fenced, that has a barn, a tractor shed, a root cellar, obviously you want those things to be in somewhat decent condition. You don't want to buy something that has all this infrastructure, but it's so falling apart that you have to completely redo it. Because then you might be paying for that infrastructure, but it's really not worth it because you have to redo it. New homesteaders and farmers really always underestimate the importance of that infrastructure. Barns are important for storing hay, for storing equipment, for storing tools, and for storing crops. If you're storing, garlic, winter squash, sweet potatoes, grain crops, if you're putting up a bunch of hay, if you have lots of tools that you want to keep in good condition, you need covered, dried-in spaces, especially here in the Middle Tennessee area in the Southeast, anywhere where you get lots of rain, even the Northeast, maybe in very dry climates and arid conditions. People don't need that as much, but here you absolutely need it. And the situations need to be very dried in, as much as dried in as possible. All that being said, you're not always going to have those dried in spaces, or you can't afford properties that have that. So you need to put that in your financial plan when you're buying land. If it doesn't have it, you need to put in the finances to build that. And that sort of infrastructure is increasingly expensive. I have a friend that just bought a bunch of property, and they didn't have any barns on it, and they built barns, and they were incredibly expensive. Granted, the barns were a tractor shed with a tool shed, and the other barn was like a barn with a completely finished living space, a wash pack shed with a walk-in cooler, concrete floors, drainages, all the bells and whistles, well insulated with everything. And, it was almost $200,000, and the barns weren't very big. And even a small barn that's not insulated is going to cost you money. So before you buy a piece of property, find out what size barn or barns you're going to need to adequately take care of your situation. And then talk to local contractors if you're not going to do it yourself, and get an estimate from them so you know what you're working with. Otherwise, if you're going to do it yourself, try and find a way to realistically understand how much time it's going to take you to do it and how much it's going to cost you to do it, because it's still going to cost you. And without the experience and the tools, it might take you more time. So just think about that. Besides barn, other infrastructures, yes, include fencing and cross fencing for livestock. Roads is another big infrastructure, which leads me to the next top mistake when buying land, which is land that has no access. Land that has no access would basically be like a piece of property that has no road infrastructure whatsoever, or is landlocked and you literally have no way to get to it, or has an easement that is a legal easement for you but is not maintained, or has to be communicated, like whenever you have to do something or repair the easement, you have to communicate with many different parties. A lot of that is happening a lot in the Tennessee area. A lot of times timber companies nowadays are timbering off a pine plantation, and then after they're timbering it off, the pine is not as valuable anymore, and they're just selling the properties for a lot of money, and they're parceling them up, and all they have is logging roads going into the property. Those roads need to be built up and made in a better condition, and have to be maintained by a whole community of people. And that road is generally on an easement, and that access is maybe potentially always going to be a headache. The road's always going to need to be maintained and upkept, and there's no legal structure to communicate how that's going to financially happen. Or a property that doesn't have any access at all and it's landlocked. Like, that's definitely happened before. Or there's no easement. You have your property, you have access from the road, but once you come in off the road, there's no developed road systems, and you have to build a road going out to all the different spots to your farm. Or you want to build out on this back hilltop, which has great solar aspect, but there's no road going out there. People underestimate the cost of building roads properly. Anyone can build a road with a bulldozer, can rough in a line, but you're always going to be dealing with problems if it's not built right. And the expenses that come in with building a road right has to do with bringing in soil, getting someone out there who knows how to build roads and knows how to work with the topography correctly, and knows how to put in culverts, because a lot of times you need culverts, or else you're always going to have problems with drainage and the road getting eroded out. So building roads can get very expensive. We quoted a road that was about 2 miles into a property, and it was just a farm road, but it was a 2 mile road, which is a long road, and we quoted it out. And obviously our company, we're always wanting to do it right. We don't want to do it quick and cheap and leave people with more headaches in the future. We want to build it right to the top spec and do everything correctly so that you're never going to have an issue with that road. We quoted that road at $80,000 going out there, and that was no concrete, no cement, no asphalt. That is a gravel road done properly from the entrance of the property all the way to the back of it, 2 miles in. And that is a price where we're not getting rich off of it. We're covering our expenses. We're making a little bit of money, but just paying for stone, paying for the heavy equipment work, paying for culverts. I think that property had, or that road in particular, had 12 to 15 culverts that were necessary so that they wouldn't have any issues, as well as drop basins at the entrance of a lot of these culverts, bringing in riprap, bringing in large, stone, as well as, 3/4 gravel and crusher run where necessary. So infrastructure, super important, and a big mistake when people buy a property. They don't realize how expensive it's going to be. The next top mistake when people buy a property is land with a poor solar aspect. A lot of people buy properties and they don't understand how to read the property when they buy it. So I've been out to many pieces of property where they might have bought 8 acres, but it's all the 8 acres is a northwest facing slope that is down at the bottom of the slope. And that is super poor solar aspect. And I'll go there and they'll say, hey, we would love to be 100% off of solar. We want to have these big gardens. We want to do all this stuff. And even at the height of the summer, they're getting, 4 hours of sunlight or less. Depending on how forested the situation is on the southern, east, and west sides of the property. So ideally, the situation that you want to have is good solar aspect in the wintertime. So you want your property to be open to the sun in the wintertime so that you can extend your growing season. And then during the season, during the summer, you want to have good east to west solar aspect. So that during the season, you have a long day and, you get good sunlight. If anything, you want protection from the north. And some things will do better on a north slope because that will force things like apples and other fruit and nut trees and berries and stuff like that to flower later and reduce their risk of getting frost damage during a late frost in the springtime. because it'll move their flowering period back. And also in the hot climates of the southeast, it will keep those crops just a little bit cooler and prevent them from getting exhausted by the heat. So having north-facing slope is important and good in this climate, but it shouldn't be the only thing that you have. And if you're way down in valley and it's only north-facing slope and you have big trees all around you, then even the things that like it cool might not do well. So having good solar aspect is super important. You have to remember that in homesteading and growing food and even growing pastures, the economy is the solar economy, is the, you want as much photosynthesis happening at human and herbivore height as possible. Something to think about. All right, moving on. Another top mistake when buying homestead properties would be land that has bad neighbors. This happens a lot. All I'll say is you want to do as much research on your neighbors as possible. A lot of times you'll have neighbors where they don't like what you're doing. They are resistant to seeing changes around them, even if it's not changes that they can legally control. They're, even in rural Tennessee where, people should be excited and used to seeing pasture and grazing animals, people might be annoyed by seeing the grass get too tall. Now, you're not going to know that really before you get into it, but just something to think about and to mitigate as much as possible. We had a neighbor that was really concerned with our grass growing in the front. It was about 2 acres of mowed lawn, and when we moved in there, we let it all grow up because we were grazing goats in there and we were putting in orchard trees and all that sort of stuff, and someone got really annoyed by it and kept calling codes on us. Now, the agricultural laws in Tennessee are great, and we beat the city, and basically our right to farm trumped their ability to ask us to mow it down. So we won out on that, and good right to farm laws are super important, and those right to farm laws need to be maintained. But there's other ways that neighbors can cause issues for you. If you move into an area that has a lot of drug problems, and that can happen in rural areas, then you might find people wandering on your property and wandering off with your tools and equipment. So that's something to think about. Or if you have polluting neighbors, or neighbors that, I was looking at a property that looked just absolutely awesome, and I was really interested in it as a scale up from the property that we're on now. But there was a toxic exposure. There were these big power lines and natural gas lines. Number one, I don't want to be anywhere near natural gas lines because the infrastructure that they're flowing through is very old and they can explode and leak. But also because those lines are maintained with really strong herbicides. They're not always maintained with herbicides, but these ones were. And not only that, but there was a neighbor nearby that was using lots of herbicide. And what was the other thing that was going on with that property? I can't remember. But yeah, just watch out for, different neighbors doing different things. If you're right next to a quarry, you have to think about the quarry dust and some of the toxic exposures that come with that. If you're right next to a confined animal feeding operation or a confined chicken operation, or commodity crop agriculture operations. Oh yeah, the other thing with that property is that there was a drag raceway right near there. I just didn't want to hear loud cars all the time racing around. I moved to a rural area to get away from the noise and get away from all of the hecticness of that. So do some research, as much research in the area as you can before you buy a property. The next top mistake when buying a homestead property is land that has significant building or land use restrictions. that's pretty straightforward. Basically, you want to look into codes and permitting in your area as much as possible. Go to the county, ask them what their codes, laws, and regulations are for all the things that you want to do before you buy the property. The next is land that has been severely abused. This is really common in Tennessee. Now, this is usually stuff that you can work with. And as, homesteaders and regenerative land practitioners, maybe we do want to buy some abused lands and breathe life into them and really take care of them so that they can shine again. All that being said, if it's so abused that you're just starting way behind, then that's just going to slow you down, and it's just going to take a little bit more creativity. So for me personally, if the land is a little bit abused, I'm happy to work with that. And if someone else buys abused land and wants to fix it up, I'm happy to help them. But I personally don't want to go into a property that has, let's say 100 acres and 50 acres of it was just brutally logged and is a complete fire hazard. All the keeper trees were damaged and are destined to die. And there's just like this super competitive regrowth, which is going to be super hard to use and maintain in any sort of way. Or if the property was so overgrazed that there's eroding gullies everywhere, the pond dam walls for the ponds that they do have are eroding out and are about to bust. There's exposed bedrock everywhere. There's no organic matter in the soil anywhere. This is a common sight in a lot of farms throughout the Middle Tennessee and beyond, area, is really abusive land practices. And that is just going to make your job a little bit harder. If you get into rotational grazing and you really work with the land, you can work wonders and improve the land in a major way. And I encourage that. But if the whole thing is abused, it's kind of, someone's got to do it. Someone's got to heal that land. But, you want to have some trees in good, healthy condition, and you want to have some pasture that's okay. And the abused parts of it you can work with and you can make better, and even the good parts you can work with and make even better than they are, but if it's just 100% abused property, you might want to think about that. The next top mistake when buying a homestead property that I have here is not thinking about the future. So not thinking about expansion of local cities and towns into your area and population growth, or not thinking about the expansion of your farm, of your potential community, or thinking multi-generations forward. So thinking about that, like, you might say, 3 acres is fine for us, and then you get into homesteading and you're like, we want to do everything, but we can't do it all ourselves, so we need like at least 3-4 other families working together on this farm to really become super resilient and grow all the stuff that we want to grow. But we don't have enough land for those people, and we don't have enough land to produce the things that we want to produce. So, thinking forward, thinking about the multi-generations. Don't just think about like, hey, my generation only. If you can, think about your generation, bringing community into the land, but also thinking about your children and thinking about them building homes, thinking about the next generation building homes, and think about having at least 3 generations on a piece of property at any given time, and having the space for all of that if you can. Now, obviously, we're all not millionaires and billionaires, and we can't afford that land. What I recommend, and this goes with being able to afford all of this, the primo property that covers all of these, different factors that we're talking about. Finding the best properties is going to be expensive, and most people can't afford that land, myself included. The way around that is either to play the money game and get really good at it and amass lots of money so that you can do this, or to get with people and to pull your money together so that you can afford that land, and that so you can live in community and you can work together to create a safe haven, a self-sufficient compound farm, family, community, beacon of light for the rest of the world. Do it now, because the world needs it. And there's no reason that Bill Gates and all of these other super wealthy people can be buying up cheap farmland all around the country and having all of this land under their belt that they're doing nothing with except driving up land prices. And people who are going to do good things and amazing things and resilient things and regenerative things with the land, there's no reason why we shouldn't have those properties. And we have to get resilient so that we can get those properties and get access to that land and be good regenerative stewards for that land and create a resilient, self-sufficient future for the coming generations. So think about the generations ahead. Get as big a piece of land as possible. Think about community. Think about the future generations as much as you can. I think that covers most of it. The last thing I had is make sure you do a security assessment. And that goes back to like the bad neighbor thing, and thinking about where your property is located. Think about, I always want to see society, come together and become, more secure. The financial situation get better for people. The food situation get better for people. The economic situation get better for the country and for the world. I want to see good things happen, but we have a very fragile infrastructure, and it's pretty clear that the global powers that control the world economy are starting to squeeze the middle class and the lower class, and starting to make things harder for people. And as that happens, the situation in the world might become more desperate, economically speaking. And you have to think about that and think about the security risks that might arise from that. And how do you make your property more secure? And, what I'm saying is, if shit hits the fan and things get really hard, I'm not saying shut the world out and become insular and, have a lookout tower that you have people on and gun down the people like trying to get onto your property to steal food. Like, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is try and get as secure as possible so that you can have a safe situation for all the people on your property, and you can keep them squared away and healthy. And from that healthy, secure position, then you can go out into the world and you can help the situation for as many people as you can and help people acquire land and grow their own food. And the more we help other people get into that situation now and get into a secure position now, the more they can turn around and help other people too. And that exponential growth can help the whole situation become more regenerative, resilient, healthy, and secure. But you have to take care of your own situation. It's a balance in life of giving and receiving. There's a balance between, putting yourself out there and protecting yourself. And finding that balance is going to be really important. With our own business that we have here, we have a lot of equipment that we have, and when we go out on the job sites, we have to lock our stuff up because things get stolen. And if things keep getting stolen, we're talking, sometimes things will get stolen and it'll be over $10,000 worth of stuff. And if that keeps happening over and over again, you're basically going to go out of business. Insurance covers stuff, but at what point is, if the economy goes down and insurance is having to take, more and more of this social burden that's going on in our society, insurance is going to start paying out less and less, and insurance is going to cost more and more. So think about your security situation and find a way that you don't have to worry about those things. And without going too much more into that, I'll make another, video on, prepper stuff if y'all want. But yeah, the whole prepper side of of land acquisition is a whole other conversation. All that being said, those are the top mistakes when buying homestead properties. The ideal things to look for is diversity in terrain, ecosystem diversity, multiple water sources, good infrastructure, good neighbors, good security situation, good solar aspect, all that sort of stuff. If while listening to this video, if you guys have thought of some other homesteading or mistakes when people make when buying homestead properties, go ahead and make a comment below and tell us those things that I missed. And maybe even make a comment telling me like the things that you love most about your property and have been the best decisions that you've made about your property. Sharing all this information with everyone is gonna, help people from making super big mistakes that cause huge headaches for them and can really set them up better. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Share as much of the information as you can, and let's get more and more resilient and create a better world for the coming generations and for now. Thanks so much.